The blizzard was relentless, turning the world outside into a swirling mass of white as I sat alone in my family's cabin. We had inherited it from my grandparents, who used to spend winters here, nestled deep in the quiet woods, surrounded by towering evergreens and a frozen lake. The cabin was a small, sturdy structure with a slanted roof, a stone fireplace, and wooden floors that creaked with each step. It felt timeless, as if it had always been a part of the landscape. I had decided to come here to get some writing done, hoping the isolation would force me to focus. The days had been ticking by without much progress, but I enjoyed the solitude. There was something about being cut off from the rest of the world that felt freeing. But as the snow piled higher outside and the temperature dropped, a different kind of tension began to settle in my chest. The silence, once calming, now seemed to amplify every creak, every rustle, and every gust of wind that rattled the old windows. The first night passed uneventfully. I spent most of the evening by the fire, wrapped in a heavy wool blanket with an old book one had found on the shelf. My grandparents had left behind a collection of worn novels and strange, dusty tomes that looked older than the cabin itself. The fire crackled, filling the room with warmth and a faint smell of burning wood. Outside, the snowstorm intensified, and the wind howled like some restless creature prowling the woods. Around midnight, I heard a soft crunching sound coming from outside. My heart skipped a beat as I put the book down and listened. The sound was faint but distinct, like footsteps pressing into fresh snow. I shook my head, convincing myself it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a fox. After all, I was in the middle of the forest, and wildlife was bound to roam nearby. Still, I couldn't resist peeking through the window, squinting into the darkness to see if I could spot anything. There was nothing, just trees, shadows, and the endless snow falling in thick, silent waves. I returned to my book, but my focus was broken. I read the same sentence over and over, my mind wandering back to that strange sound. Eventually, I convinced myself it was nothing. I went to bed, letting the wind's howling lull me to sleep. The next day, the storm only seemed to grow worse. By evening, the snow had piled so high against the cabin that I was practically snowed in. The temperature had plummeted, and even with the fire roaring, I could feel the cold seeping through the walls. The sense of isolation grew stronger, as if the cabin was being swallowed by the storm itself. I tried to distract myself by working on my writing, but my mind kept drifting, my fingers tapping idly on the keyboard. As night fell, I heard it again. Footsteps. This time they sounded closer, like someone was walking slowly around the cabin, circling it. My heart began to pound, and I felt a cold sweat prickling my skin. I stood up, my ears straining to catch every sound. The crunching of snow was unmistakable, and there was a rhythm to it, almost like someone pacing outside. Summoning all my courage, I crept over to the window and pulled back the curtain. Outside, the snow was still falling heavily, and the visibility was poor, but I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the reach of the cabin's light. It was hard to make out any details, but the figure was tall, thin, and unmoving, almost as if it was watching me. I blinked. In that split second, the figure was gone. I closed the curtain quickly, my mind racing with fear and confusion. Who would be out here in the middle of a snowstorm? And why would they be watching me? I tried to rationalize it, telling myself it was probably just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees. But deep down I knew something wasn't right. A few hours later, as I sat by the fire trying to calm myself, a loud banging sound jolted me from my thoughts. It was coming from the front door. Someone was knocking, slow and deliberate, the sound echoing through the silence. My heart felt like it was going to explode as I stared at the door, unable to move. It couldn't be a visitor. I was miles away from the nearest neighbor, and there was no way anyone would be traveling in this storm. The knocking continued, steady and insistent, as if whoever was outside was waiting for me to answer. Against my better judgment, I got up and moved toward the door, each step feeling heavier than the last. My hand trembled as I reached for the lock, and I hesitated, wondering if I should even open it. But my curiosity got the better of me, and I slowly unlocked the door, opening it just a crack. There was no one there. I stared out into the swirling snow, my breath fogging in the icy air. The snow was untouched, pristine, as if no one had been near the cabin at all. I shivered and quickly closed the door, locking it and backing away, my heart still racing. I told myself it must have been the wind, that maybe a tree branch had hit the door, but deep down I didn't believe it. Something felt wrong, like there was a presence lurking just outside, hidden in the shadows. That night I barely slept. I kept hearing faint noises, scratches at the windows, soft thuds on the walls, and once, what sounded like a whisper. I pulled the blankets over my head, trying to block it out, but the fear kept me wide awake. Every creak of the cabin made me jump, and every gust of wind felt like a sinister force pressing against the walls. By dawn, the storm had eased, and a pale gray light filtered through the windows. I got up, feeling exhausted and on edge. I decided to go outside to check around the cabin and reassure myself that it was all in my head. When I stepped out, the snow crunched under my boots and the cold air bit into my skin. I walked around the perimeter of the cabin, scanning the snow for any signs of disturbance, and then I saw them. Footprints leading from the edge of the forest to my door. The tracks were deep and fresh, as if someone had been standing there recently, watching the cabin. I followed them with my eyes, noticing that they circled the cabin a few times before stopping at the front door. There were no tracks leading away. A chill ran down my spine as I stood there, staring at the footprints. It was impossible. If someone had been there, where did they go? The snow was undisturbed beyond the cabin, and there was no sign of anyone leaving. It was as if they had vanished into thin air. I rushed back inside, locking the door behind me. I could feel my hands shaking, and my mind raced with thoughts of what I had seen. I knew I couldn't stay here. Whatever was out there, it was not human, and it was not friendly. I packed up my things as quickly as I could, not caring about the storm or the snow. I just wanted to leave, to get away from that cabin and whatever was haunting it. As I drove away, the cabin faded into the distance, swallowed by the trees and the snow, and I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. But even now, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me. It happened during a particularly brutal winter, one that kept everyone indoors and bundled up for days on end. Snowstorms came one after another, piling the snow high and burying cars and houses alike. My family and I had just moved to a small town in the mountains, hoping for a quieter life away from the city. We rented a house at the edge of town, surrounded by thick woods that stretched out for miles. I quickly grew to love the silence and isolation, or at least I thought I did. One night, during a particularly intense storm, my parents went out to a friend's house for a party. I was 15, old enough to stay home alone and take care of myself. I had planned a quiet evening of movies and snacks, enjoying the rare freedom of having the house to myself. The snow was falling heavily outside, creating a muffled silence that was oddly comforting. The only sounds were the occasional crackling of the fire in the living room and the soft hum of the heater. I was halfway through my third movie when I noticed something strange. Through the flickering light of the TV, I saw shadows moving across the windows. At first, I thought it was just the trees swaying in the wind, but then I realized the shadows were moving too deliberately and too close to the glass. I paused the movie and listened, but all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. I tried to shake off the fear, telling myself it was just my imagination, but the unease settled in my stomach, refusing to let go. I decided to check the windows to see if anything was outside. I walked over to the front door, peering through the glass panel beside it. The snow was falling thickly, and I couldn't see more than a few feet beyond the porch. But there, half hidden by the snow, were faint footprints leading away from the front door and disappearing into the woods. My heart skipped a beat. The footprints were fresh, meaning someone had been here recently, standing right outside the door. I hadn't heard anyone knock, and there was no sign of a car or any other tracks leading to the house. It was as if someone had simply appeared, left their mark in the snow, and vanished. I tried to calm myself, rationalizing that maybe someone had gotten lost and come up to the door, hoping to find shelter. But something about the footprints unsettled me. They were small, almost childlike, and spaced too close together, as if the person had been shuffling rather than walking normally. I stared at them for a long time, my breath fogging up the glass as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. Finally, I turned away from the door, deciding it was best to just ignore it. I went back to the couch, wrapped myself in a blanket, and tried to focus on the movie, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. Every creak of the house and every gust of wind outside made me jump. After a while, I started to feel foolish, convinced that I was letting my imagination run wild. I got up to make some tea, hoping a warm drink would calm my nerves. As I poured water into the kettle, I heard a soft tapping sound coming from the living room. I froze, straining to listen. The tapping was rhythmic and deliberate, like someone knocking on a door. Slowly, I walked back to the living room, my eyes scanning the windows. The tapping grew louder as I approached, and my heart began to race. When I reached the front door, I stopped, my hand hovering over the handle. I didn't want to open it, didn't want to see what was on the other side. But the tapping continued, insistent and unrelenting. Taking a deep breath, I opened the door a crack and peeked outside. There was nothing there, just the empty porch and the falling snow. The footprints were still visible, leading away from the house and into the darkness. I let out a shaky breath, feeling both relieved and unsettled. I closed the door, making sure it was locked, and went back to the couch. But as I sat down, I heard the tapping again, this time coming from the back of the house. I jumped, my skin prickling with fear. The tapping was soft, almost gentle, as if someone was trying to get my attention without alarming me. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I had to see who or what was outside. I grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made my way to the back door. My hands were shaking as I unlocked it and shone the light outside. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the backyard and the edge of the woods beyond. I scanned the area, but there was nothing unusual. No footprints, no signs of movement, just snow and silence. I closed the door, my mind racing. I was sure I had heard the tapping, but there was no one there. I went back to the living room, determined to stay calm. But as soon as I sat down, the tapping started again, this time at the window beside the couch. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly I turned my head, dreading what I might see. There, pressed against the glass, was the faint outline of a handprint. It was small, like a child's, and smudged, as if the person had dragged their hand down the window. My blood ran cold, and I felt a surge of panic rising within me. I didn't know what to do. Part of me wanted to run outside and confront whoever was tormenting me, but another part of me was paralyzed with fear. I backed away from the window, my eyes fixed on the handprint, and reached for my phone. I dialed my parents, but the call wouldn't go through. The storm must have knocked out the signal, leaving me completely cut off. I tried to keep myself calm, telling myself that I was just imagining things, but the tapping continued, moving from window to window, as if something was circling the house, watching me from every angle. I felt trapped, helpless, unable to escape the constant reminder that I wasn't alone. Hours passed, and the storm finally began to let up. The tapping stopped, and the silence returned, heavy and suffocating. I stayed awake until dawn, my body tense and exhausted, my mind racing with fear and confusion. When my parents returned in the morning, I told them everything, hoping they would believe me. They looked around the house, checked the windows, and found nothing. The handprint was gone, and the footprints had been covered by fresh snow. They assured me it was just my imagination, a trick of the storm and the shadows. But I knew what I had seen, what I had heard. I spent the rest of the winter dreading the nights, always listening for that soft, insistent tapping. When I was little, my family used to visit my grandparents every winter. They lived in an old house on a hill, the kind that creaked and groaned with every gust of wind. Surrounded by dense pine woods, the house felt like it was in its own world, far removed from any town or neighbor. My grandparents loved it. They always said that the isolation made the winters feel more magical, but to me, it was eerie. One winter, when I was about 10, a particularly brutal snowstorm hit just after we'd arrived for the holidays. The roads quickly became impassable, so we were stuck at the house for what we thought would only be a few days. My parents assured me it was fine. They said we'd use the time to play games, tell stories, and enjoy the quiet. But the longer we were snowed in, the more restless I became. The house was old, and at night, it seemed like every corner held a shadow or a noise. I'd hear footsteps in the hallway even though everyone else was asleep. Sometimes it sounded like someone was walking slowly up and down the stairs, dragging their feet. My grandparents would say it was just the old pipe settling, but I wasn't so sure. One night I woke up to the sound of soft singing. At first I thought it was my mom or grandma, but when I sat up and listened, I realized the voice was unfamiliar. It was gentle, almost comforting, like a lullaby. The melody drifted through the house, filling my room with an odd calm. I lay back down, thinking maybe I was just dreaming, and eventually fell back to sleep. The next morning I mentioned the singing to my grandma, who smiled and said that it was just the wind playing tricks. But as the days passed, the singing continued, always at the same time every night, always the same soft, soothing tune. My parents and grandparents didn't hear it, and they brushed off my concerns, but I knew what I was hearing. One night, I decided I'd stay awake to see if I could figure out where the singing was coming from. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, straining my ears to catch the first notes, and then, right on time, I heard it. This time, though, it sounded closer, almost like it was coming from the hallway outside my room. I climbed out of bed, shivering as I wrapped myself in a blanket and tiptoed to the door. I opened it just a crack and peeked out, expecting to see nothing. But there, at the end of the hallway, I saw a figure. It was a woman, standing in a long, flowing nightgown, her hair loose around her shoulders. She was looking out the window, humming the same melody I'd heard each night. For a moment I thought it was my mom, but something about her seemed off. She was too still, almost like she was frozen in place. I wanted to call out, but the words stuck in my throat. I couldn't move, couldn't look away. After what felt like hours, she turned around. Her face was pale, her eyes dark and hollow. She looked straight at me, and I felt a chill that went down to my bones. She didn't say anything, just kept humming that haunting tune as she slowly drifted down the hallway and disappeared into the shadows. I backed into my room, my heart racing. I climbed into bed, pulled the blankets over my head, and squeezed my eyes shut, hoping I'd fall asleep and forget the whole thing. But sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, her empty, staring eyes. The next morning, I was too scared to tell anyone what I'd seen. I didn't think they'd believe me, and even if they did, what could they do? We were still snowed in, still trapped in that old house with whatever she was. Over the next few nights, the singing stopped, but I could still feel her presence. It was like she was watching me, waiting for something. I couldn't shake the feeling, no matter how much I tried to distract myself. I started sleeping with the light on, hoping it would keep her away. Finally, after what felt like forever, the roads cleared and we were able to leave. As we drove away, I looked back at the house, half expecting to see her face in one of the windows. But the house was empty, silent, as if it held no secrets at all. Years later, I mentioned the experience to my grandma, thinking maybe she'd laugh it off as just a child's overactive imagination. But she didn't. She got quiet, her expression serious, and then she told me a story. Apparently, many years before, a woman had lived in the house. She was a maid who had worked for the family that owned the place before my grandparents. She died in her sleep, right there in the house, in one of the upstairs bedrooms. Some people in town believed her spirit still lingered, singing her lullabies, waiting for someone to hear her. I don't know if I really saw a ghost that winter, or if it was all in my head, but I still think about that night. Every time I hear a soft, unfamiliar melody, I'm taken back to that cold, dark hallway, to the woman with the hollow eyes. When I was in college, a group of friends and I decided to rent a cabin for a winter getaway. We were all looking for a break from the stress of finals, and a cozy cabin in the snowy mountains sounded like the perfect escape. The place we found was affordable and charming, tucked away in the woods with a fireplace, plenty of beds, and the promise of total solitude. We arrived just before sunset, hauling our bags and groceries inside, laughing and planning the weekend's activities. The air was crisp, and the thick blanket of snow gave everything a peaceful, almost magical atmosphere. We settled in, made some hot cocoa, and gathered around the fire, talking and telling stories. It was the kind of night that felt too perfect, like something out of a movie. But as the fire crackled and the night grew colder, we started noticing things that were off. The first was the sudden chill in the air. Despite the roaring fire, the temperature seemed to drop, and a strange draft swept through the cabin. We joked that it was just the wind sneaking in through an old window, but the feeling of unease lingered. After a few hours, one of my friends, Jenny, went outside to get more firewood. She was gone for longer than expected, and we started to get a little worried. Just as we were about to go looking for her, she came back inside, looking pale and shaken. When we asked what happened, she brushed it off, saying it was nothing, just that she'd felt like someone was watching her. We all laughed it off, teasing her for being paranoid, but I could tell she wasn't entirely joking. There was something in her eyes, a glint of fear she couldn't hide. Later that night, as we were settling into bed, we heard footsteps outside. They were faint, just soft crunches in the snow, but they were steady, circling the cabin. We froze, listening, hoping it was just an animal or a stray hiker. But the footsteps stopped directly outside the front door, and then there was a quiet knock. No one moved. We exchanged nervous glances, whispering to each other, wondering if we should answer it. After a long pause, my friend Tom gathered the courage to go to the door. He opened it slowly and found nothing but an empty porch in the vast darkness of the snowy woods. But something was there. In the snow leading up to the door were footprints. They were deep, clear prints, as if someone had been standing there for a while. The strange part was that they didn't lead anywhere. There was no trail from the woods, no tracks leading away, just a set of footprints that started and ended at our doorstep. We closed the door quickly, locking it, and tried to laugh it off. But the mood had shifted. That perfect, cozy night had turned into something unsettling. The wind picked up outside, howling around the cabin, and the shadows cast by the fire seemed to stretch and shift in ways that didn't feel natural. None of us slept well that night. Every creak of the cabin, I lay awake, listening to the quiet breathing of my friends and the sounds of the night, unable to shake the feeling that we weren't alone. The next morning, we all tried to shake off the night's events, chalking it up to nerves and our overactive imaginations. But Jenny, who had been the most shaken, insisted on going home. She said she'd had a nightmare about someone standing over her bed, watching her sleep, whispering her name in a cold, raspy voice. We convinced her to stay, promising that we'd stick together, that nothing was wrong. She reluctantly agreed, but I could tell she wasn't at ease, and honestly, neither was I. The daylight made everything seem normal, but there was still a heaviness in the air, a feeling that something was waiting. That night we tried to keep the mood light. We played games, cooked dinner, and avoided talking about the previous night. But as soon as the sun dipped below the horizon, the unease returned. The cold draft crept back, despite the fire, and the shadows seemed to deepen, swallowing the warm glow of the cabin. As we were sitting around the table, we heard it again, footsteps in the snow, slow and deliberate, circling the cabin. This time, no one was brave enough to go to the door. We sat in silence, listening as the footsteps moved around us, stopping occasionally, then continuing. And then once again there was a knock. A slow, deliberate knock, as if whoever or whatever was outside knew we were there and was waiting for us to answer. I don't know what compelled me, but I stood up, inching toward the door. My friends whispered for me to sit back down, but I felt drawn to it, like I had to know what was out there. I reached for the doorknob, hesitating for a moment, before pulling the door open. The porch was empty, but the footprints were back, fresh in the snow, leading to the door. I stared at them, trying to make sense of it, when I noticed something even stranger. At the edge of the clearing, just beyond the line of trees, there was a figure. It was dark, featureless, standing motionless, watching. I slammed the door shut, my heart racing. I told my friends what I'd seen, and the look in their eyes told me they believed me. We decided then and there that we couldn't stay another night. We packed our things, grabbed our coats, and made our way to the cars. As we drove away, I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that figure standing in the clearing watching us go. But there was nothing, just the silent, empty cabin and the shadows of the trees. We never spoke of that trip again, and I've never been back to that part of the mountains. But every winter, when the wind howls and the snow falls, I think of those footprints, the figure in the woods, and the sense that something out there had been watching us, waiting for us to invite it in. There was something.